Jubilee recently released a video of a vegan debating and going head to head with a group of meat eaters. And they covered something which I think is pretty fundamental, which I think most people who aren't antinatalists would have missed. So in this video, I want to go over that, break it down. But before we actually do that, let's watch the clip.
Yeah. So I will not defend factory farming. There is another way of producing meat, and it is regenerative agriculture.
Okay.
And regenerative agriculture reduces all of the harm. Okay.
Doesn't reduce all of the harm.
Well, the majority of the harm, they live beautiful lives on regenerative
just
ranches.
One bad day, right?
Right, absolutely.
One bad day. I've had bad days, bad hair days.
They don't know that it's coming, but they're serving.
No one's ever
they're serving their purpose. But they're okay. But here's the deal: would they even exist in the first place if they weren't being harvested for meat? No. Let me just ask you a question. Do they have the right to exist? Yeah, because you're cutting me off. Do they have the right to exist?
Well,
because here's the deal. If you're saying that we should not harvest them, then those animals are never going to exist. So I guarantee if they had consciousness and you put them down and you said, here are the scenarios, you can either exist and you can have one bad day and you can serve a purpose and you can have a beautiful life. You can make a positive contribution to the environment.
You can make a.
Can I finish? Can I finish?
Yeah, but you're taking a pause.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've heard the case.
So when I die, I want to be buried in the soil and I want to decompose so that my carbon returns to grass.
So even though it was a brief clip, there are a whole bunch of things to break down here. The fundamental point that is being made here that I think antinatalists will be really interested in and have something to say about is this idea that we benefit animals by bringing them into existence and then slitting their throat at some point so that we can then benefit from their existence. So the very first thing I want to say is actually in response to the last thing the guy said, which is this idea of the fact that he wants to contribute back to the earth and be buried and then decay and go back into the grass. And you know, it's this sort of naturalistic and almost sort of mystical, some people give it, idea of this sort of circle of life, this sort of energy that recycles over and over again, and we are part of that. And whilst many people find that a nice idea, I'm sure this guy didn't have in mind that he was going to have his throat slit and then that happen, which is what he's advocating for. But anyway, there are three main things I want to address from this clip that I think antinatalism has something to say about. So the first one to cover is animals having this purpose. Their purpose is to be brought into existence, used as a tool, killed so that we can eat them, and that's the purpose that we've prescribed them. And there are two things I want to say on this. The first is that there are a lot of similarities between this talk of purpose when it comes to animals and things that are implicit, sort of implicit purposes that people are appealing to when they talk about procreation with an antinatalist, when someone is trying to justify bringing a child into the world. Obviously, it's not as common for people to explicitly appeal to a purpose that the child is going to have, although sometimes people do that, like I need a worker on my farm or something like that. But these tend to be frowned upon, and I think many people have gotten to the point where they view it as quite disgusting to at least explicitly state that they're creating a child because they have some purpose for that child. But there's still a lot of implicit ways that people sort of reference purposes that their child will have. So think about things like this. People say that their child can support them when they're older or help them in other ways. People say that they are lonely, and so they want to create a child because it will bring them some level of comfort, or essentially any justification someone appeals to in creating a child that is going to benefit them. The purpose of creating that child is to benefit them. Unless someone, in my eyes, in a deluded sense, says they are creating the child for the child's sake, which I don't think is possible, that seems like the only way that you would not be appealing to a purpose, because otherwise the purpose would be to benefit you in some way or benefit wider society, for example. And so there's this through line between this explicit statement of a purpose for animals and this more implicit presence of purposes that people appeal to when it comes to procreation. But then the second thing I wanted to say about this whole thing of purpose is let's just try and remove any speciesist bias from this case. And let's imagine we're talking about humans with similar cognitive abilities as pigs, cows, chickens, for example, of which there are humans. Would we feel as comfortable, think it's ethical to say that we're going to bring those children into existence, they can have a good life, and then we will kill them at some point for our benefit because that is their purpose? I don't think so. When we remove the speciesist bias from this equation, we understand that it is grim and disgusting to apply purposes to people in this way, especially when it's simply just to benefit us, and it's going to include slitting their throat. The second point this guy makes, which I want to cover, is he argues, what about their right to exist? What about the animal's right to exist? You're denying their right to exist by not bringing them them into existence. The first thing is non-existent beings don't have a right to come into existence. Do non-existent children now have rights to exist? Are you now committing yourself to having as many children as possible, lest you deny all of those children you could have had a right to exist? I mean, why is this guy here doing this video? Surely he should be at home making hay so that he can create children, so that he's not denying their right to exist. This is a ridiculous assertion, and I think this guy realizes that. I think he was just reaching in this conversation. He doesn't actually believe that animals have a right to come into existence. He doesn't think he's some grand shepherd that is ushering souls into existence because he's benefiting them because they were being violated in non-existence, because they weren't having their rights fulfilled. This is a ridiculous notion. And if he stopped to just think about it for 1 second when he wasn't in the heat of a debate, he'd realize that it was a ridiculous thing to say. And then the third thing I want to note on is this idea of we're benefiting animals by bringing them into existence at all. And I think this is really the sort of fundamental underlying thing that is sort of under all of this. Because if we all recognize that we weren't benefiting animals by bringing them into existence, you would probably appeal to these other things less. So the first thing to say is that obviously for the vast majority of animals we breed into existence, it's not a benefit to bring them into existence. It would be ludicrous to say so. Most of the animals we bring into existence live miserable lives in factory farms, and then there are many, many billions of animals that we rip out of the ocean who we didn't breed into existence, but we still rip them out of the ocean and they go through a horrible dying process. I don't think it is these animals this guy is appealing to when he says we're benefiting them by bringing into existence. If he is, then I think it's even more silly, but at the beginning of the clip he said he wasn't defending factory farming. So we've got to assume these aren't the animals he's talking about. The animals he's talking about are these sort of La La Land fairy tale picturesque farm animals that do exist, but it's La La Land in the sense that these are a vanishingly small number of animals, and the way that we actually understand their lives to be is not what their lives are. These animals tend to be, they live in wide outdoor areas. This does not mean that they're kept with their families. This does not mean that they are free from disease. This does not mean that they are free from weather exposure or predation sometimes, and obviously they're not free from death. So it's La La Land, not in the sense that these don't exist. Those sorts of animals do exist. They are just in vanishingly small numbers compared to the animals that live miserable lives, and it's La La Land in the sense that the actual picturesque scene we paint in our heads that is somewhat tethered to reality is not actually tethered to reality in any substantial sense, because we still tend to paper over all the cracks of the suffering in their lives. So again, let's remove any speciesist bias and replace these animals with similarly cognitively able human beings. So human beings that have the same level of cognitive ability as a sheep, a cow, a chicken. Again, which there are many humans around the world with that level of cognitive ability. Severely disabled people, mentally disabled people, or actually even all of us for parts of our lives when we're babies, or maybe when we get older and we become way more mentally degraded. So now we have the same picture, but instead of non-human animals, it's human animals in their place. Would we still think that we'd benefited them by bringing them into existence? You bring these humans into existence, you give them a life which isn't as ideal as this guy is trying to make out, but still, relative to all other animals, it's a pretty good life. And then one day you take them aside and you slit their throat. Or let's even remove any of the suffering in their life. Let's say you bring these humans into the world all for the purpose of eventually killing and eating them, but you bring them into the world and they have a life that they actually do genuinely enjoy, and then one day you take them aside and you slit their throat. Are people still going to say that we're benefiting those people by bringing them into existence and killing them just so that we can eat them, which is the same thing as what we're doing to the animals? I think less people would say that we're actually benefiting those people by bringing them into existence in this context. But let's just step back and think, any context, when are we bringing them into existence? When we bring someone into existence, we bring them into a life that they didn't exist to want in the first place, and we bring them into a state of vulnerability where they can be harmed and suffer. The quote-unquote nice life they have is only desired by them because they exist already. It wasn't desired before they existed. And so we're appealing to something to justify bringing them into existence that they only want and enjoy and benefit from because we brought them into existence. It's simple circular reasoning. And so we've brought them into existence, and now they're vulnerable to harm and suffering, and they die as well. And in this instance, they're having their throats slit. None of this paints a picture of someone that we've benefited by bringing into existence, let alone the animals that we bring into existence and murder because we like sandwiches. If you're interested in this whole question of are we benefiting animals by bringing them into existence and then killing them as part of the food system, then the main paper I could find on this topic that you might be interested in is this paper by David Benatar, We Have No Moral Duty to Eat Meat, a reply to Nick Zangwill. And I've linked that in the description if you want to find that and read through that. The final thing I wanted to say on this before I finish off the video is that I think what we've just gone over is a core part of antinatalism. Antinatalism is predominantly known for the sort of prescription that having children is morally wrong or procreating is morally wrong. That is the most well-known, that's sort of like the quote-unquote poster child of antinatalism, this sort of view that it's morally wrong to procreate. But I actually think a bigger and more significant part of antinatalism is this question of bringing animals into existence for the food system. Now, I've covered this in a video before about whether antinatalists should be vegan. Again, I've linked that in the description below. But the reason I think this is actually a bigger part of antinatalism and a very, in general terms, under-recognized part of antinatalism is because unlike the children that we can bring into existence, the animals that we pay to be brought into existence via our food choices or other things like, animal testing in our cosmetic products or leather for coats, in the clothing industry, these animals are brought into existence in much larger numbers, even by us as individuals, and they lead much worse lives on average. This is why it seems to me like actually a more core part of antinatalism. It's not the one that gets our emotional appeal as much because obviously reproductive decisions seem much more personal and significant to us than do our eating habits or our clothing habits, for example. But in terms of scale, in terms of numbers, in terms of severity, the animal question actually seems bigger. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments below. Had you seen this Jubilee video already? What did you think of the discussion on Jubilee? And I'll see you in the next one.